Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
So, Marcus, you're back in the home studio now.
Back home from good old Germany. The weather wasn't any better. However, it's good to be back, plus it's a bit of a treat for myself. I, by sheer coincidence, somehow got connected to Professor Keith Grint, who is a professor emeritus at University of Warwick, and he's been studying wicked problems a lot. So I'm happy as a spring chicken for this one.
Well, we don't ever talk about wicked things on this podcast.
And never. We do it in a wicked way, I guess. But yeah, I think it's always bits and pieces. And I think in this case, it's really nice to have someone really focused on, and having studied for, 30 odd years or more, 40 years, I don't know, these kind of phenomena and how that affects organizations. In this case, we're going to talk about his book, Leadership, a Short Introduction. And he also kindly sent us a couple of other papers around COVID-19 and other different kinds of problems and clumsy problems as well. So we're going to talk about a lot of really, really interesting stuff that I find.
Are we going to put the links to those
really
in the
relevant.
show notes?
Oh, most definitely. And yeah, so, but what are your takeaways from it?
So, the idea that leadership is in a progressively more rational sort of track and trend, I thought that was interesting. And what I would, at the end of the kind of discussion, agree that it is indeed leadership is moving in a more rational direction, but the tools are then used to drive people more emotionally and understanding how to engage with enough people to get things moving forward without trying to convince everybody to be able to move forward and the emotional connections associated with that. So I liked that. And I also liked our discussion that we had about consensus-driven decision-making versus kind of big leader decision-making. And it is one of my favorite expressions, as you know, this whole kumbaya, hold hands and sing kumbaya and make a decision, and nobody's responsible if it goes right or if it goes wrong. And the idea that kind of egalitarian leadership style is great for information gathering, which I thought is really positive. But at the end of the day, it's not always the best way. Sometimes it's the worst way to actually get decisions made. And I liked that clarity and how he defined those two differences.
Yeah, exactly. Just to elaborate on that, because I think it's definitely one thing I sort of agree with, but there's other parts that I think we've seen popping up in a lot of episodes around leadership and learning, but also a shift in governance. So I think I obviously agree, and I see that in a lot of projects where you have to connect with people emotionally in order to get anything done. You have to get them excited, because I think in the end, as someone said on one of the bigger projects I was running, we're trying to start a movement here, and movements are very emotional and they take time, and you have to start with the early adopters and then move up, because it's a very emotional thing. It's you building the next belief system, the next level or the next iteration of the next belief system that the organization, that the people will gather around, that the people will decide to join this company because of that culture, right? So you need to create a new culture normally, a shift in culture at least. However, even so, that's the method you use in order to get people on board. I think there's another part when you say there is logic and rationale, but I think there is also an area that we need to start exploring, which is not rational and logical, which is a lot of There's a lot of emotional things going on there. And often wicked problems are made of a lot of people who react emotionally. So the rationality is sort of really hard to measure and really hard to get to. And I think it's nice to agree that sort of we have to go there, but it's hard to get there. And one way to get there is, as we talked with Keith about, is to shift that A, the usual adage of saying, or the usual insight of saying, well, leaders are not there anymore to give answers or provide the solution. They're actually there to define the problem better or help direct
To
what
ask better
problem,
questions.
which way you're looking at the problem at this point. Why you're here and what's the purpose of this. Exactly. The other part is then that if that's true, if leadership has moved from providing solutions or saying what to do into asking questions, then who's going to answer those? And I think the answer for that is, well, at least to me it's clear, but I think for a lot of organizations is a bit of a struggle because of shifts in governance, is that, well, the people who work in your company should start answering questions, but also ask questions back, to treat a problem as an assumption, to treat hypotheses as hypotheses and assumptions, and then to help validate them or discard them and say, right, well, that's right and that's wrong. And be able to then, therefore, what people often call failure, like try something and it doesn't work. And I think the longer we talk about it, the more I want to say it's actually not failure. You're always learning something. It's always actually a success in having learned something. And there is no other way with wicked problems than to try something. And 90% of things you'll try will fail, but you do 100 of them a day, and you'll always get 2 or 3 successes. So actually, you're succeeding every day, right? That shift in being able to enable your people to make decisions and challenge what the assumptions are seems to be pivotal to getting into that next phase of where modern companies should be.
Yeah, and it's not an easy step, but I absolutely agree with you. It's getting to a situation where you can do experiments, not succeed, learn, change, and do again.
Yeah.
But on that note, it's getting cold, it's getting dark, it's going to get wet very soon. Does that mean it's time for us to actually go to the interview?
Let's go to the interview.
Okay, this is Troy doing a mic check.
Yeah. Keith, can you quickly just say a word or two?
Yep, this is
Please.
doing a check.
Sounds good. Lovely. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Professor Keith Grint. Hello, Keith, and thank you for making time for us.
You're very welcome.
So let's start. There's probably a lot to talk about because you got quite an amazingly impressive body of work. Plus, I'm very excited because we're going to be talking properly, hopefully, about wicked problems and tame problems, which is my little steckenpferd there. So let's start by tell our listeners a little bit who you are and what you do and what you write about, please.
Okay, so Keith Grint, I'm a professor emeritus at Warwick University. I've had an academic career of just over 30 years. I spent 10 years before that working in various forms of industry, most of them in mind-numbing jobs. And then I became an academic. Most of my work has been around most of my academic work has been around leadership, and in the last kind of 15 years, leadership associated with wicked problems and how you deal with those. And then I've also written stuff on kind of wider perspectives. I've just finished a book on leadership and mutiny, which is looking at dissent, which is something I've always been quite interested in. So that's me.
Yeah, let's start with getting our listeners a little bit in on the tame and wicked problem differentiation and what it is in your own words, because I'm pretty aware it's something that not everyone's necessarily familiar with. So tame and wicked problems, what are they? What's the difference?
Okay,
Please.
so the original work for this came out of a paper by Rittel and Weber in 1973, and they basically distinguish between two kinds of problems that face us. Tame problems are problems that we face all the time, and we basically know how to solve them. So they're problems that usually have some kind of standard operating procedure. They're kind of mechanical or technical problems, and we have learnt across time how to fix them. And they don't cause us a huge amount of problems. They are sometimes complicated, but they're not complex. In other words, when you take them out of their context and fix them, put them back into the context, you haven't really changed the context. Whereas when you look at wiki problems, you have changed the context because they're kind of moving targets, as you would actually say. So that's tame problems. Wicked problems are a different category altogether. Wicked problems we don't know how to solve. They're either novel, so we don't know what to do with them, or they're recalcitrant. So we've had them over and over again, and for some reason we just don't seem to be able to fix them. Um, they're the kind of problems that sit outside our knowledge and usually require more than one of us to be able to fix them. So they're not open to technical expertise because they're quite often kind of political problems rather than technical problems, and they quite often require some kind of collaborative or collective effort to address them. And we may never be able to fix them. They might just be something which is going to be with us forever. So there's an argument, for example, that COVID-19 is a one example of a wicked problem that we may never be able to solve. We may be able to manage it better, but we might just have to learn to live with it. So problems like COVID-19, possibly, unless we get some kind of antidote to it, and also problems like crime or ill health or bringing up a family or those kinds of problems, which we very often try to avoid looking at. They're quite often long term. So if you're a political leader, for example, it's quite often not in your direct interest to address a wicked problem because this may involve a huge amount of time and effort. There may be no particular answer, and it may require you to persuade followers or voters to do something they don't necessarily want to do. So, for example, there are elements in the pandemics where political leaders require their citizens to stay indoors and not to go out. That's never going to be a popular thing. And if you keep doing this, it becomes less popular across time. So, wicked problems are quite often associated with telling people things they don't want to hear. And that, of course, makes them even more difficult, much more difficult than tame problems. I mean, in the original work that I did, I added a third category, critical problems, which are the role of, in my phrase, they're in the role of the commander, where you have to be very decisive and take the action that is required now. But that's not in the original Riddle and Weber work. I just decided that there was a missing piece of the jigsaw. So taming wicked problems and critical problems too. One of the difficulties with them is that when you kind of draw them up, what you end up with is what appears to be a typology or a box which puts these problems in. But in reality, that's just a heuristic. That's just a teaching device, and we know that actually most problems don't come with a box marked tame, you know what to do with me, or wicked, you don't, and you need some advice. They come in a bit of a mess, and there are bits hanging out, and people disagree about which bit belongs to which category. So this is almost by definition a political problem from the very start. And we know that many people have a kind of default responses to all kinds of problems. You know, some people like managing their way out of a tame problem. They like the kind of the skill approach, and we know that when people are facing wicked problems, they very often tend to default to a managerial approach to assume that the solution is actually a standard operating procedure or science will help us out, and they tend not to assume the opposite, that this requires a different kind of approach. And the same occurs with wicked problems. You know, there are some people that like dealing with very complex issues that require collaborative effort, and they like dealing with that levels of ambiguity. But quite often, if you take that to an extreme, you end up not making any kind of decisions. So these are not necessarily better or worse approaches. They're just different ways of thinking about how you deal with different kinds of problems.
Yeah, as it's definitely something that, because a lot of the projects we're involved in, are around a change and transformation
Mm.
nature, or, if you look at service design, that always requires multiple stakeholders, multiple
Mm.
people involved to solve such a thing. And because there's so many people involved on both sides of the solution and trying to find a solution, or being exposed to the solution, they tend to be quite of a wicked nature. And I'm always trying to talk to organizations about what this actually means, because a lot of organizations don't seem to be aware of that. And taking some words from a paper you sent us on social construction of leadership, you say it's a naive assumption that we can render the context or situation transparent enough through scientific analysis. So that, and I think I've read something similar in Rittle's writing, where he said, scientific or engineering approach just doesn't cut it, or the way, or it's not the right approach to wicked problems. Can you elaborate in that a little bit more? I think you said something a little bit earlier, but can you elaborate a little bit more
Sure. Yeah. So
on that?
this is basically an argument against contingency theory. So a contingency theory would be, so you tell me what kind of a problem you've got, and I'll tell you what to do about it. And I think that implies that we agree or can find out what the situation is. So if you take, for example, whether there were ever weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, if we do enough science, we can find this out. But actually, you can't find it out. These are political arguments, hypotheticals about whether there were or there weren't weapons of mass destruction. And the only real way to find out was to dig up the entire country of Iraq to look for them. And in the absence of that, you can't do it. So this is the equivalent of, when you look out of your window and you look at the world outside, which bit are you looking at? You can't possibly look at everything in your vision. It's not physically possible to do that. There are too many variables involved. There's too much information coming into your eye. So you just select a particular point. And the question is, which point are you selecting, and why are you selecting that point? So when I'm looking out of my window now, I'm looking out of at an apple tree, but there are lots of trees around the apple tree. So why am I looking at the apple tree? And that implies that there's something about the way that we look at the world which is not rooted necessarily in the science of the externality. It's not objective. This is a kind of subjective thing. That for some reason, for whatever reason, I'm attracted to the apple tree and not everything else. And when you're trying to explain what's going on in the world, you can't explain everything in terms of everything. So this is always this is quite an interesting issue about whether academics are too theoretical, and what they should do is avoid theory and just describe the world. But this is a bit like saying, so how do we explain knife crime? Well, knife crime is a consequence of people carrying knives. But that isn't an explanation, that's just a description. The explanation for why knife crime occurs might go back into all kinds of issues about how the police treat people, how people end up in particular kinds of cultures where it's a kind of issue of masculine identity to carry a knife, or it's actually about self-defense, or it's about lack of education. There are hundreds and hundreds of possible variables in trying to explain why we end up with knife crime. And what an academic theory is trying to do is to say, okay, so there are hundreds of variables, which are the most likely, and it's these three are the most likely because theoretically this is what happens. And I think the issue of the social construction of leadership then implies that when somebody is trying to say something, what you have to think about is, so where's the theoretical origins of that? Where's the basis for saying that? And what's the theory for implying that if we separate by 2 meters, or we only have groups of six, or we don't go to the cinema, or we do wear face masks, what's the science behind this? And of course, what we've discovered in the pandemic and COVID-19 is that these are highly contested. And that's the point of the social construction argument, that these are always highly contested. And for a variety of reasons, we plump and find ourselves loyal to a particular group of theories, and quite often, what underlines our notions of truth is actually loyalty to some culture rather than loyalty to any objective truth or fact.
Yeah, and I think that's really fascinating to look at again, isn't it? Because it seems that ever since, maybe not just since the Industrial Revolution, but there's a lot of what people often call verticals in organizations and the way groups of people look at things. The same with the theories, right? That for a long time we just looked at these verticals, and oftentimes there weren't any connections between them,
Mm.
meaning that we had only that a slim piece of the truth,
Yeah,
and not no means maybe to even go beyond that. Even though I think maybe there's an argument today that now that we have more tools and it's, for example, working in organizations, it's easier and cheaper than ever to go and talk to a customer or talk to a bunch of people to figure out a bit more what's going on, and to produce solutions that can be variants that don't just take the first three, but maybe the next five possible explanations into account as well, and consider that when producing solutions for a problem, right?
yeah,
So somewhat we seem to have evolved on that. At the same time, organizations and leadership seems to be caught up with, no, it's only those vertical things, it's only those biggest numbers, and everything else we don't consider. And for me as a designer, it's interesting because as a designer, it was always interesting to get closer to academia and science, and it seems to always be of a jarring way, the jarring way we would talk about it, where scientists are very accurate and sit within particular boxes and are very aware of what they can and cannot measure, whereas designers always seem to be going quite beyond that quite easily and more confidently,
yeah,
because they're
yeah,
considered more emotional aspects of it, which are really, really hard to measure,
yeah. I think
if not at all.
yeah,
But they're more familiar with the complexity.
yeah.
Um,
I think that that notion of familiar with the complexity is important. It's a bit like until you begin to read into a topic, you know everything about it. And I can remember the VSI book that you're talking about, very early on, before I even began to read about leadership, I practiced it in my previous lives, and I thought I knew quite a lot about it. And then when I began to read, I realized I knew basically nothing about leadership. And now I think I know even less about leadership because there's so much out there, and you don't realize what it is that you don't know. There's the kind of Socrates and his arguments about ignorance is about you don't really realize until you look into something just how ignorant you are. So there is something in there about um, recognizing your own fallibility and your own desire for certainty, which means quite often what we tend to do when we're looking at these kinds of problems is search for an instant solution. And that saves a lot of anxiety, even though in reality, that the problem is we should be looking at the question rather longer than we're looking at the answer. But we are trained and rewarded to give instant answers, a bit like a kind of business consultancy. It's hard to go and sell your services when you go and say to a corporation, "So this problem you've got, I'm not sure there's a solution to it." Right, in which case they'll find somebody that has a solution to it. And it's the equivalent of, if your football team is struggling, what you do is you get rid of the football manager, and then when you do interviews, you ask the manager, "Can you get us back into the top division within the season?" And if they say no, then you find somebody who says yes. Now, whether they actually do it or
yeah.
secondary to the confidence that they generate with the answer, as opposed to, well, there's a lot of complex variables involved in getting your team back into the top division. I don't want to hear about complex variables. I want to hear somebody who's confident about, world beating test and track system. I don't want to hear somebody say, this is really complicated and I'm not sure about that. And
Yeah.
that is an issue that stymies a lot of leaders, that we know that people are attracted to leaders who appear to be confident about everything, whether they're
I think that's
yeah, whether they
I
are or
think
not. It's that's what people seem to want.
Yes, I think, people, and maybe that goes back to the way our brain is structured, right? It's just so energy intensive to consider things and question things rather than, oh, if it's close to what I know, if it's close to, or if it's simple enough, I'll go with it because
Yeah,
that's a low energy
yeah,
effort from my
yeah,
side, so that makes me happy, right?
yeah,
To some extent, we're probably built like that. But the other part I wanted to pick up on, therefore, and that's also taken one from your writings, and if I remember, projects I ran, for example, over at BT with so many people, very, very complex. Um, it's interesting when you try to apply all that theory, and there's so much out there, but there's a lot of been written, as you said. Some of those ideas are back from the 60s, 70s. They've been around for half a century,
Yeah.
still haven't not been quite picked up as much as they should have been. But there's also the difference between the theory and the reality, right? So you take a model, you take a methodology, and then you apply it to reality. And I've never been in a single project where I would 100% apply or be able to apply what's in the book, because that's not how people work. But often organizations seem to think about that's how it can work. And you talk about something called clumsy problems, I think. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah. So the clumsy term, it comes originally from work by Mary Douglas, who talked about cultural theory. Her argument is that by and large, again, this is a heuristic sense-making activity. By and large, you can divide cultures up in terms of people's response to rules and people's response to roles. So you can have organizations that are very rule bound, or you can have organizations that are very bound into the group. And when you divide those, the rule bound and the group bound approaches, you get what has been called elegant cultural theory. So you get hierarchists, you get egalitarians, you get individualists, and you get fatalists. And her argument is that by and large, most organizations fit roughly into something like this box. Although, again, the closer you look, the more granular the approach, the more you realize that actually organizations fit across a lot of these boundaries. But anyway, so the point is that when you're facing a tame problem, that your organizational culture was probably constructed to resolve the tame problem, so that you develop standard procedures for fixing 75% of the stuff that comes across your desk every morning. That the culture that you've developed across time is perfectly efficacious for those kinds of problems. But the difficulty is that those same elegant cultures tend to be disproportionately antagonistic to when you're facing a wiki problem. Let me give you an example of how this works. So a few years ago, I was doing some work with some social workers, children's social workers, and they had developed an elegant culture which is primarily egalitarian. So whenever they were having a meeting about the safety of a child, they developed a culture where everybody could chip into the conversation, that there wasn't a hierarchy involved in this. If you've got something to say about this child, then it was your duty to say it. And the culture was very supportive of everybody lending a hand and coming to some kind of group decision. Because if you kept information back, if you were frightened of what the boss might think and you didn't say something about the child might die. Now, what that elegant and egalitarian culture also did is make it really difficult for the same group to make individual decisions about children. So even though we could collect lots of information about a child, if it then became my responsibility as an individual to make a decision about the child, it was very difficult to do in a group, because the group was always distracted and would dispute what should be done about this. So what's happening here is the elegant culture is great for getting information out. We're all a team here, we're all a group, let's just talk about this child. But in terms of making the decision, what the group predominance did is make it difficult for individuals to make decisions. And that was actually quite useful, because it protected individuals from being held responsible if something terrible happened to that child. So the elegant culture that they had developed was really good for information gathering, but really bad for decision making, because it also protected people from responsibility. And organizations tend to do that. They develop cultures which are good for some things and bad for other things. And the clumsy argument is, when you're trying to address a wiki problem, you have to get beyond the norm, your normal elegant cultural approach, whatever it happens to be. You have to get beyond that and start thinking about how you can approach it with different kind of cultural forms. So let me give another example. I had a PhD student at one point who was looking at a military unit, and the officer in charge of the military unit wanted to develop an egalitarian group to discuss the future of this particular military group. The problem is, of course, with a military, it's very, very hierarchical and very formal. So they were very resistant to any kind of egalitarian groupthink, because what they wanted to do is stick to their ranks, or stick to their stovepipes, their skill stovepipes. So the boss of this particular group said, "Well, this is inhibiting us from thinking about what the future will look like in 20 years. So we're going to have an egalitarian approach to this, and every month we will have a dinner. There'll be no uniforms, so you won't know what rank people are, and we will use first name terms, and we will have a broad discussion about what the future is of this particular group." And my PhD student's task was to facilitate these dinners and discussions over 18 months. And he said the really strange thing about this was this particular group did operate as an egalitarian group, despite the hierarchy, despite the stovepiping, for the first time ever. But it only ever worked as long as the boss, the overriding commanding officer, was still in the room. Now, if you were trying to design something using the elegant cultural mode and you wanted an egalitarian group, you would have all kinds of rules and procedures for making sure that nobody was in charge and it was an egalitarian proceeding. But that didn't work. And the clumsy bit was the only way you could make the egalitarian group work was if you had the hierarchy sitting around the egalitarian group, i.e., if the boss was in the room. As soon as the boss left the room, the egalitarian group broke back down into its hierarchy of rank and its stovepipes of skills. So this is what we would call a clumsy approach. You wouldn't design it like this. You would never design an egalitarian group to fit within a hierarchy, because they seem to be counterproductive. But it actually worked, and that's the point with the clumsy bit. Sometimes these things just evolve by practice. I mean, they have to work in practice. But if you were to look theoretically and say, would this work? The answer would be no, because it's contradictory. And that's the point. Quite a lot of the so-called clumsy approach is to say, well, not can we design something which looks nice on paper, but what is actually working, whether it's hypothetically accurate or theoretically sophisticated, does it actually work or not? That's the clumsy bit. Does it work?
And I really like that part of the book, that you sometimes need a clumsy solution. Elegance doesn't always work.
Yeah,
One of the companies I used to work for was very much consensus-driven decision making.
yeah,
And it was literally, you'd all get in a room, you'd all have the discussion, you'd all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and then a decision was made. And that meant that nobody was to take credit and nobody was to take blame.
yeah,
And the alternative, of course, was the Steve Jobs approach, which was the lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way, because this is where we're going.
yeah.
And trying to find the difference between those two. So the title of the book that you've written that we're talking about today is Leadership: A Very Short Introduction. And now that we've kind of gotten, hopefully, a good foundation of understanding the difference between tame, wicked, and critical problems, and looking at elegant and kind of clumsy solutions, what was your inspiration for writing this particular book? What were the key things you want people to take away from this particular book?
So I'd come across the Riddle and Weber stuff about 1992, I think, when I was working with some health service organizations. But I previously come from a quasi-military background. My father's in the British Army, and I'd actually done quite a lot of teaching for the Army. Even though I was never going to join the Army, I was quite interested in it. And they were always talking about the role of command. And the role of command never really sat easily with the division between management and leadership in the work that I was also writing about. So I began to think about, so where does command fit in here? And that's really where adding in the third variable, problems, critical problems, came in. That this would be a space where you would be coercive. You would not be looking for help from somebody else. There would be no kumbaya leadership. We would not be singing round tables or holding hands. You would do exactly as I told you, which is different again from the tame approach, which was, we pay you lots of money, you're very skilled, you know what to do, just go away and do what you normally do.
Mm.
So I think I was trying to to work out whether there was a gap in the original work, and that's why I added the third aspect in. And I think it's that the critical role is also important in trying to prevent people from ending up in the kumbaya approach, as you call it, simply because a lot of my academic colleagues are so pro groups, egalitarians, and democratic approaches that it seems to them that there aren't really any tame approaches. There's just this we should all get together, hold hands, and everything will be fine approach. And I spent a lot of my life trying to argue that that is a really important point for the beginning of how you address a wicked problems. You do need an egalitarian group to enable you to get all the information out and to start a different way of understanding how to deal with a problem. But even within wicked problems, there comes a point in time where you must do something about it. And if you don't, then things will get worse. So if you look at current environmental problems, I think we still seem to be in the kind of wicked zone with environmental problems about what the hell are we going to do with this? And everybody needs to be on board to do something. But if we get 10 years down the road and not much has been done, and we have significant increases in temperature, there'll come a point when we won't be asking you, would you mind not wasting all the water? We'll be telling you, you aren't getting any water on Thursdays or Tuesdays. So
Mm.
you shifted it from a wicked problem to a critical problem because we have not been able to come to some kind of decision. So I still think that there's a role for the coercive, and again that rubs up a lot of people. They think I distinctly remember working with some very junior graduate social workers on a program, and I'd made this argument about these three decision modes, and one of the very young social workers who'd only just started said, I disagree fundamentally with your assumption that we should be coercive or we should have a command role." And I said, well, there will be some situations in your life where you need, for example, to be taking children away from their parents because the children are at risk, and you have to coerce them and use the law and take the children away. And her response was, no, that will never happen, because I think what happens is we'll be so skillful in our approach to these parents that we'll be able to stop them from doing anything dangerous. So we'll never have to take the children away. And my response was, I think you're in the wrong job.
Yeah.
And that was the last time I got asked of that particular group, because I think I really offended them. And I think this is the point about bizarrely, the leadership role is getting people to understand that there are some things, some lessons they don't want to listen to. And your job is to tell them this is the unpleasant truth and you need to listen to it.
I think this is one of the things where, you can start with the ineffectiveness of certain meetings, even in any situation where you have 10, 20 people in the room and everyone is there to voice their opinion,
Yeah.
not based on facts, just on their gut feeling. And you go, right, so what are we going to do now? And I've been in plenty of workshops and where people have arguments as well about saying brainstorming doesn't work because if you just have these things flying around the room,
Yeah.
you might end up with a very simplistic, run-of-the-mill kind of first solution everyone comes up with. So you never break into new ground.
Yeah.
The other part is also that, let's say, and we do that a lot in design thinking, where everyone's voice is heard. You write the ideas up, and then you come up with about 100 ideas. So how do you start prioritize? Well, you have to prioritize because you have to fact check it with reality. How do you do that? You can't fact check 100 ideas. It's too much. How do you whittle it down to, let's say, 10? We got to have some kind of methodology to do so.
Yeah.
And the problem then you're having is, yes, so people want to bring in their opinion. They often like their ideas too much and less are curious about learning more about the problem. And often the facts are not there. So in the absence of the facts, because you had no time to test it yet, how
Yeah.
do you get from here's an idea, here's a gut feeling too? Because that's what we face in design often, right? That's why we experiment so much, step by step, to get closer to actual reality. And I've seen it in a lot of organizations where unfortunately people are there in their position in order to make a decision or to contribute despite their expertise, or even if they have expertise, it doesn't still mean the 10 years, the last 10 years of your expertise are still relevant because things are changing. especially with wicked problems, less so with tame problems. And so how do you usually find when you have to talk about that transition between, okay, fair enough, you know this for 10 years, or fair enough, you've had one experience, to then branch out and say, but there are about 100 possibilities, and therefore there is this uncertainty. So how can we make decisions or filter things down, or focus on one thing and not the other? That always seems to me like a really, really tricky challenge for the mind, or for
Yeah.
imagination,
Yeah.
or for the confidence to say I might be wrong. How do you
Yeah.
how do you manage that space?
Yeah. No, and I think that even that argument about accepting that you can be wrong is a kind of primary
Yeah,
step here. I mean, partly it's to do with what Aristotle talked about in terms of pragmatic wisdom, the notion that you can. There are three things that you need in life. You need skill, you need knowledge, but you also need what he calls pragmatic wisdom, which is the ability to reflect on what's happened before and whether it was successful or not, why it would be successful or not. So his argument is there aren't very many wise young people because they haven't not had enough experiences, but some have, and there aren't. I mean, there are lots of old people that have had lots of experiences, but they're not very wise because they haven't reflected on anything that they've done. So the
yeah,
real skill is to get into the habit of reflecting on things. Why did that work or why didn't it work? Is one kind of um, skill that I think leaders need to navigate with, to be able to say, under these circumstances, this is the best way forward, knowing what kind of people I'm looking at. And I think that's also associated with, Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher of science, sometimes associated with the so-called Popper question, which is try and frame a question which would get people to think about alternatives. So the Popper question would be, in this particular instance, what do I need to say or do or stop doing to get you to understand that what you've just said is not really helpful, or to understand that the idea put forward by Mary is a better idea than you? What do I need to say or do? And they might say nothing because my ideas are always better than Mary. In which case, you're just wasting your time. But they might say, well, if you can find me some data which would prove under these circumstances Mary's idea is better, then I'd be interested in accepting that I'm probably wrong. So at this point, you now know what you need to do to get people to change their minds. And I think the big problem is that people get so defensive about their own ideas and they begin to rationalize. But so whatever point you put forward, people just have an explanation for why you're wrong. It's a bit like trying to work out, why people support Trump. It doesn't matter what Trump does. It doesn't matter what you say. There is always some justification that they can produce for why they're still going to vote for Trump, because
yeah.
is X or Y. And I think this exposes the limits of rational thinking, the limits of rational logic. That there comes a point in time when, if you're hoping to get a consensus here, with any kind of wicked problem, you're probably not going to get it. What you need to think about is, can I get enough people on board to try something different and see whether we can make some progress? Not, what do I need to do to get all 50 people on board before we could make any kind of progress? And I think that kind of exposes the current problems with things like environmental issues. That if we're waiting for everybody to accept that we have an environmental problem and something needs to be done, then it's going to be too late.
But it also seems to be this part where, when you talk about rational thought or rational decision making, that if we are tapping into the area of wicked problem, often we have this emotional aspect of it, and how much can we measure emotions really at this point? Maybe we can have a facial expression that we can measure these days through cameras and whatever. We're just about there, but there's no way we can really know what emotions are going on in people, measure that, and see what's really happening. And I think that's sort of that's the thing that seems to be a bit blocker. And I think famously you mentioned Trump, but I remember there was a study they did years ago back with George W. Bush when they went into the Iraq War, and even people who were shown the memos that they were proving that he was lying,
Mm,
people would still stick to the original thing. Oh yeah, well, it's the president, I still trust
yeah,
him. It's like, no, literally,
yeah,
I showed you the president lying.
yeah,
They would still find some way around in their head to justify that there
Yeah.
was still trust in the president. It was mind-boggling. So if that's sort of the hurdle we have, and I'm surely have that a lot of times in when I'm in change and transformation projects, because a lot of times processes and things that happening in groups of people are essentially belief systems, and belief systems are the toughest to overcome. And
Yeah.
if a belief system is in these kind of, oh, only what matters, only what we measure matters, and there's this area that we're fully aware of has an impact, has a relevancy, but we can't really measure it yet. This seems to be a nearly, I mean, I think we're at a shifting time at the moment, because maybe technology might enable us, but it seems there's this massive hurdle to overcome to really step into this new era of where we can consider these things and maybe change our minds a bit more easily. I don't know
Yeah.
what you're
So
thinking, where science can, theory can bring us there.
I'm not sure about whether technology is going to be able to help us, simply because I think Mary Douglas is right. Her argument is that organizations are run on the basis of loyalty, not rationality. So that, if I'm your friend, or we're in the same group, or we support the same football team, then I'm more likely to support you than somebody else who's actually saying something which is more logical than what you just said. So I think there is that problem. The other issue, I think, is the kind of constant quest to find some kind of scientific or technical method for resolving some of these human problems, and I don't think we're going to get there. And I think this in itself is a wicked problem, and the response is perhaps to think about, can we make it less locked into loyalty, less locked into irrationality, rather than actually locked into rationality. So it's kind of minimizing the problems rather than removing the problems. I think that in itself is a wicked problem, that we set ourselves a goal which is so beyond what we can achieve that we end up just giving up and doing something totally different.
Yeah. I like the whole idea of discussing rational leadership versus kind of emotional drivers and emotional sort of driven behaviors. Because I think we've seen a lot of that in the last 5 years, whether we're
Yeah,
talking about Trump or whether we're talking about Brexit.
yeah,
And even though in the book you posit the fact that we're moving towards a more rational leadership style, I find that most of the mechanisms those leaders are using are connecting with people at an emotional level. And there's a real conflict kind of associated with that. But I'm going to jump all the way to kind of one of our last questions, just towards the end of the book. You reference that, heroic leaders have been responsible for most of the tragedies that have befallen the human race. Why
mm,
have we only just recognized their fallibility? And to some of your other points, I don't think people have. I don't think even if they recognized that those leaders were fallible, they were just so committed, they were emotionally committed to that leader at that point in time, that they're driving all the way through it. They can't ever back up and admit, that was wrong, that was a mistake, or I'm going to look at things differently next time.
yeah.
And you get this kind of momentum going. How can organizations watch out for and or inoculate against that kind of behavior? How can they give people the freedom to say, I made a mistake, without having all of the judgment and all of the fail associated with that?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question. I think ultimately it runs into an argument about permission giving, that it's the role of leaders of all kinds to give permission for other people to either accept that they've made a mistake, or to accept that they're wrong, or to criticize them. And in the absence of that permission giving, then not a lot of stuff gets done. And the number of times I've heard leaders, especially business leaders, say, my door's always open. So if you want to come and tell me if you screw things up, because there won't be any punishment involved. We just need to learn this about what's going on. And yet, how often have you heard that same leader, same business leader, say, "Oh, by the way, last Friday I lost us £2 million by screwing this contract up. Sorry
Mm.
about that, but nobody died, and we haven't lost any. No one's lost a job. So I think I've learned something, and I really hope you learn something from what I've just done." But in the absence of that permission giving, it's okay to make mistakes and to accept it and learn from it. We seem to get this notion that the people at the top seem to seem to be indelible, seem to be perfect, and everybody else is okay to make mistakes. So I think, we have a whole systematic approach which is built into this notion that the last thing you want to do is accept that you've made a mistake, and that is then supported by, say, if you take political leaders. This is a classic example where a political leader is going in one direction and everybody is saying this is the wrong direction, and then the political leader will say 2 weeks later, okay, I've changed my mind, we're going to go back in that direction, and everyone says, oh, U-turn.
Yeah.
Why didn't you just keep going in the wrong direction? What's the matter with you? Why are you so weak? So there is something even in the responses that we have to people that accept they've made a mistake, which means it's even more unlikely for them to say, actually, no, you were right, I screwed this up, sorry, let's go back to the beginning and let's start again. It's really hard to be able to say that, and it's like listening for any politician now to come on television and say, "Do you know what? I am responsible for this," and actually mean it. And because I'm responsible, I'm going to resign. And those days seem to be long over.
Yeah, it seems to be like when you look back at the American presidents, and I think it's probably been affecting other leaders in the world. I think people stopped apologizing for literally anything they did a long, long time ago. It's just not a thing they do anymore. I think they did it maybe back in the 70s to some extent, but it seems
Yeah,
to be totally have left the behavior that
yeah,
they seem to be okay with. I mean, I
But hold
think,
on. I know a couple of
yeah,
political public relations PR people, and that is one of the things they tell politicians, specifically as coaches. You must never admit you were wrong. So
yeah,
they actually are coaching people, saying that the public
yeah.
sentiment will turn on you and you will lose all credibility if you ever admit that you made a mistake. And that's horrific.
yeah.
I see. I'm wondering if maybe at times need a different kind of leader again. I mean, we see that, and it easily gets into when we just talked about failure, and we talk a lot about failure in kind of a system that accepts failure, and you just talked about it earlier, Keith. But and I know we have to wrap up because we're quite close to the time. I know we have to go into another meeting. I think it's a great thought to end up in, and it probably easily gets us into maybe an argument of experimentation, small experimentation, trying little things, and so failure never becomes big and too risky. However, I'll finish here. I'll say thank you so much. This is probably one of the biggest episodes we had so far, about where there's so many questions. We could easily do another one, probably a couple of hours long. Thank you so much for your time, Keith, and thank you for your insights.
Okay, I'll just say one more thing, and this is about,
Yes, please.
we began with Rittel and Weber's stuff in 1973. It's also worth digging back out Lindblom's arguments about muddling through, because I think that's essentially what we're talking about in Wicked Problems. It's about not looking for the perfect strategy. It's how we muddle our way through because we don't know what we're doing, and that's okay.
Great. Well, thank you for
Brilliant
giving us
sentence to finish.
definitions
Lovely.
for wicked problems on the Wicked podcast and Marcus's book, The Wicked Company. So it's been a very wicked time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.